Have you ever wondered what it feels like to bury the love of your life? Completely alone? I'm 79 years old, and I never thought I'd have to answer that question. But 3 weeks ago, I stood in front of an empty chapel, staring at my husband's casket, and realized that sometimes the people you raised can become strangers wearing familiar faces. My name is Helen Morrison, and this is the story of how I lost my family long before I buried my husband, and how I finally found the courage to let them go. It started on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that feels too ordinary for something so final. The funeral home called at 8 a.m. to confirm the service time. 2 o'clock. I'd chosen his best suit the night before, the charcoal one he wore to our 50th anniversary. My hands trembled as I pressed it, remembering how he'd smiled that day, his eyes crinkling at the corners the way they always did when he looked at me. "Still got it, Hel," he'd whispered, pulling me close for a dance we never finished. Now that suit would be the last thing anyone saw him in. I called my daughter first. "Sarah." She answered on the fourth ring, her voice distracted, hollow. "Mom. What's up?" "The service is at 2, I said quietly. "St. Michael's. Your father." "Oh, Mom." She cut me off with a sigh. "I completely forgot to tell you. I can't make it. I have this client meeting that's been rescheduled 3 times, and you know how important." "Sarah." My voice cracked. "It's your father's funeral." A pause. Then, "I know, and I feel terrible, but this is my career we're talking about. Dad would understand. He always said work came first, right? I'll visit next weekend. We'll have a proper goodbye then." Next weekend. As if the dead could wait. As if grief had office hours. I hung up before she could hear me cry. Then I called my son Michael. Voicemail. I left a message, my voice steadier than I felt. He texted back 20 minutes later. "Something came up. Can't make it. Sorry, Mom." 4 words. 23 years of raising him, and I got 4 words. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone, waiting for it to ring again. Waiting for one of them to call back and say they'd made a mistake. That of course they'd be there. The phone never rang. And that's when I knew. I had raised my children to take, but I'd forgotten to teach them how to show up. But what I didn't know yet was that their absence would change everything I'd planned to leave behind. The funeral home felt colder than it should have. Or maybe that was just me. I arrived early, dressed in the black dress I'd worn to my mother's funeral 15 years ago. It still fit, though it hung differently now. Looser in some places, tighter in others. Age does that. It reshapes you without asking permission. The director, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Carson, greeted me at the entrance with practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Morrison, everything is prepared. The flowers you selected are beautiful. White lilies, just as you requested." I nodded, unable to speak. William had always loved lilies. He said they reminded him of new beginnings. "Will the family be arriving soon?" Mr. Carson asked gently. I looked past him at the empty rows of chairs. "No," I said simply. "It's just me." His expression shifted, surprise then pity. I hated that look. The one that said how sad. How terribly, unbearably sad. But he was professional enough not to press. He simply nodded and guided me to the front row. The service was short. A minister I barely knew spoke about William's life, reading from notes I'd provided. He talked about William's career as an electrician, his love of fishing, the garden he tended every spring. He spoke about a man he'd never met, and I sat there feeling like I was attending a stranger's funeral. The truth was bigger than any eulogy could capture. William wasn't just an electrician. He was the man who rewired our entire house by hand when we couldn't afford a contractor. He wasn't just a fisherman. He was the father who taught our children patience by the lake, even when they complained about the heat. He wasn't just a gardener. He was the husband who planted roses under my window, so I'd wake to their scent every June. But none of that mattered now, because the people who should have been here to remember him weren't. I looked around the chapel one last time before they closed the casket. A handful of William's old co-workers sat scattered in the back. A neighbor from 2 streets over. The mailman who'd delivered our letters for 20 years. Strangers and acquaintances, but not family. Not Sarah with her client meetings. Not Michael with his something came up. When they lowered the casket into the ground, I stood alone by the graveside. The wind pulled at my coat, and I felt the earth shift slightly beneath my heels. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Not because I wasn't grieving. I'd been grieving for months, but because some sorrows are too heavy to fall. And standing there in that cemetery, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being the mother who gave everything and received nothing. It was time they learned what loss really felt like. The house felt different when I returned. Not emptier. It had been empty since William passed 2 weeks before the funeral. But heavier somehow, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I walked through each room slowly, letting my fingers trail along the furniture William had built, the curtains I'd sewn, the photographs we'd framed together. Our entire life was here, preserved in wood and fabric and frozen smiles. I stopped at the mantel and picked up the photo from our 50th anniversary. William's arm was around my waist, both of us laughing at something Sarah had said. Michael stood beside us, his hand on his father's shoulder. We looked like a family that day. We looked whole. I set the photo down and walked to the kitchen. The bottle of wine I'd been saving, a good Merlot from the cabinet reserved for special occasions, sat waiting. I poured myself a glass and sat at the table where William used to peel apples with surgical precision, arranging them in perfect crescents. The ones with the most sunshine, he'd say, always giving me the best piece. The fruit bowl sat untouched now, a few overripe pears sagging under their own weight. I pulled out my phone and opened it to Sarah's social media page. I rarely looked, but something compelled me today. Her latest post was from 2 hours ago. A photo of her and 3 friends at a trendy brunch spot downtown. Mimosas raised, smiles bright. The caption read, "Sunday fun day with my girls. Bottomless mimosas and endless laughs. Living our best lives." Posted while her father's casket was being lowered into the ground. I scrolled to Michael's page. He'd posted too, a photo from a golf course, his new club glinting in the sunlight. Perfect weather for the back nine. Closed a huge deal today. Life is good. I stared at the screen until it blurred. Then I turned off my phone and took another sip of wine. The anger I'd been pushing down all day finally surfaced. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, clarifying kind. The kind that settles into your bones and whispers truths you've been avoiding. My children hadn't just missed their father's funeral. They'd chosen to miss it. Chosen mimosas and golf over goodbye. Chosen their comfort over his memory. And in that moment, sitting alone in the kitchen where William once made me feel cherished, I realized something profound. I had spent decades being their safety net, and they had never once asked if I needed catching. That night, I decided to call my lawyer. Not out of spite, out of clarity. Because if they couldn't show up for William's last day, they didn't deserve what we'd built together. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at William's old desk in our bedroom, surrounded by the paperwork of our lives. Files organized in his careful handwriting. House. Taxes. Insurance. Family. That last folder, family, felt heavy in my hands. I opened it slowly. Inside were copies of our will, documents we'd prepared 2 years ago with our attorney, Richard Brennan. Everything was laid out clearly. The house, the savings accounts, the lake cabin William's father had left us, even the antique clock that had been in his family for 3 generations. All of it divided equally between Sarah and Michael. I read through each page, my reading glasses slipping down my nose. Sarah was listed as the primary beneficiary on our investment account. Nearly $280,000 accumulated over 40 years of careful saving and frugal living. Michael was set to inherit the lake cabin and half the value of the house. We'd been so careful, so fair. We wanted to make sure they were both taken care of, that they'd have something solid to build their own futures on. But as I sat there in the dim lamplight, I realized something. We'd been planning to give them our legacy, but they'd already stopped being part of our lives. I pulled out another folder, one I'd kept hidden in the back of the drawer. Inside were years of records, bank statements, canceled checks, receipts I'd saved because I believed in keeping track of things. $18,000 for Sarah's wedding. She'd said it would be small, intimate. It had been anything but. $9,500 when her roof needed repairs after that bad storm. The baby's room got soaked, Mom. We're desperate. $25,000 for Michael's business startup that failed within 8 months. William had warned me not to send it. I did anyway. Another $15,000 for his daughter's medical bills when his insurance wouldn't cover it all. Car payments. School tuition for the grandkids. Emergency loans that were never paid back. Year after year after year. I added it up in my head. Over $120,000 in the last 15 years alone. Not counting the smaller amounts, the groceries I bought, the bills I quietly paid, the countless times I said yes when I should have said no. And for what? So they could post brunch photos while their father was buried? So they could play golf while I stood alone beside an open grave? I closed the folder and sat back in my chair. The decision crystallized in that moment, sharp and clear as winter ice. Tomorrow I would call Richard. And I would change everything. Because love isn't measured in dollars given, it's measured in moments shown up for. And they'd shown me exactly where I stood. Richard Brennan's office smelled like old leather and lemon polish. The kind of place where time moved slowly and decisions carried weight. I'd known Richard for over 30 years. He'd handled our first mortgage, William's business contracts, and eventually our estate planning. He rose from his desk when I entered, genuine surprise crossing his face. "Helen, I didn't expect to see you so soon. Please sit down." I settled into the leather chair across from him, my purse clutched in my lap. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, catching the dust particles in the air like tiny witnesses. "I got your message," Richard said carefully, sitting back down. "You mentioned wanting to revise your will. Urgently." "Yes." My voice was steadier than I felt. "I want Sarah and Michael removed entirely." He paused, his pen hovering over his legal pad. Not shocked. Richard had been practicing law too long to shock easily, but concerned. "Helen, are you certain? This is a significant decision." I met his eyes. "I buried my husband 4 days ago, Richard. Alone. Our children didn't come. Sarah had a client meeting. Michael had something come up. Not a flower. Not a phone call. They were too busy." Richard's expression softened. He'd known William too. They'd played chess together occasionally at the community center. "I'm so sorry," he said quietly. "William deserved better than that." "Yes, he did." I opened my purse and pulled out the folder I'd brought. "And so do I." He took the folder and reviewed the documents inside. Our current will, the beneficiary forms, everything that currently had Sarah and Michael's names on it. "You want to remove them from every provision?" he asked. "Every single one. The house, the accounts, the cabin, the insurance policies. All of it." Richard made a few notes. "And do you want to redirect these assets to someone else? Or establish a different arrangement?" I thought of my grandson, Dylan. Sarah's boy. 20 years old now, studying engineering at the state university. He was the only one who visited regularly. Not because he wanted something, but because he genuinely seemed to enjoy my company. Just last month, he'd shown up unannounced with his toolbox and fixed the loose railing on my porch. "Grandma, you could have fallen," he'd said, his concern genuine. "Why didn't you call someone?" "Because everyone else I called needed something from me first." "Yes," I said to Richard. "I want to set up a trust for my grandson, Dylan. He should have the house, the cabin, and the remainder of the estate. I want it structured so his parents can't touch it." Richard nodded slowly. "I can arrange that. We'll make it ironclad." And for the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. But I had no idea that word would spread faster than I expected, and that my children's true colors were about to show even more clearly. The paperwork took nearly 2 hours. Richard walked me through every clause, every provision, making sure I understood exactly what I was doing. "Dylan won't have full access until he's 25, Richard explained. "Unless it's for education or medical expenses. Does that work for you?" "Perfect," I said. "I want him to have security, not just money he can spend foolishly." Richard made notes in his precise handwriting. "And you're absolutely certain about excluding Sarah and Michael? Once these documents are filed, it becomes very difficult to reverse." I thought about the empty chapel, about the mimosas and the golf course. About all the years I'd spent being their bank account, their babysitter, their solution to every problem, while they never once asked if I needed anything in return. "I've never been more certain of anything," I said. He nodded and continued drafting. As we neared the end, he looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Helen, I have to say, most people your age want to keep the peace. They forgive. They make excuses. They convince themselves that family is family, no matter what." "I kept the peace for 50 years, Richard," I said quietly. "And it buried me long before it buried William." He didn't ask any more questions after that. By the time I left his office, the autumn sun was stretching long shadows across the sidewalk. I stood outside for a moment, breathing in the cool air, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, not relief, but something close to freedom. I drove home slowly, taking the long route past the lake where William used to fish. The water was gray and calm, reflecting the overcast sky. A few geese glided across the surface, heading south for the winter. Everything was changing. Everything was letting go. When I got home, I made myself a proper dinner. Not leftovers, not something quick. I made the roasted chicken William loved, with rosemary from the garden he'd planted. I set the table with our good dishes, the ones we usually saved for holidays. I lit a candle and ate slowly, savoring each bite. Halfway through the meal, my phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Hey Mom, just checking in. How are you holding up?" I stared at the message for a long moment. 4 days after the funeral, and this was her checking in. Not a phone call. Not a visit. A text message that probably took her 30 seconds to type. I set the phone face down on the table and continued eating. She'd sent dozens of texts over the years asking for money, for favors, for help. Those I'd always answered immediately. But this one? This one could wait. Because I was done responding to crumbs of affection from people who only remembered me when it was convenient. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about all the things I'd saved over the years. Not just money, though there was plenty of documentation of that, but memories, moments, pieces of a family that maybe only existed in my imagination. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out the storage boxes I'd kept on the top shelf. Inside were decades of photographs, letters, children's artwork, report cards, Mother's Day cards made from construction paper and glue. I carried them to the living room and sat on the floor, something I hadn't done in years. My knees protested, but I ignored them. The first box was labeled Sarah Childhood. Inside were her baby photos, her first day of school pictures, a ribbon she'd won at the science fair in 5th grade. There was a card she'd made me when she was 7, covered in crayon hearts. "To the best mommy in the world. I love you more than ice cream. Love, Sarah." I traced my finger over the words, smudged now with age. When had she stopped feeling that way? When had I become less important than ice cream, let alone her client meetings? The second box was Michael's. His Little League photos, the trophy from the spelling bee, a Father's Day card he'd made for William with a drawing of them fishing together. "Dad, you're my hero. Thanks for teaching me to be patient. Love, Mike." William had kept that card in his workshop for years, taped to his toolbox. It disappeared one day, probably fell off and got swept away. But he'd remembered it. He'd quote it sometimes when Michael called asking for money. "Remember when I was his hero?" William would say quietly after hanging up. "Now I'm just his ATM." I'd tell him not to be cynical, that Michael was just going through a hard time, that things would get better. But they never did. They just got more expensive. I found more evidence as I dug deeper. Birthday cards I'd sent with checks inside. $50, $100, whatever I could afford. Most of them had been cashed within days. But the thank you calls? Those took weeks if they came at all. There were emails I'd printed out. Sarah asking if I could watch the kids for the weekend. Actually make it the whole week, her yoga retreat got extended. Michael wondering if I could co-sign on a loan, just temporarily, just until his credit improved. Always asking. Never offering. I gathered all the boxes and carried them back to the closet. But I didn't put them back on the shelf. Instead, I stacked them by the garage door. Tomorrow, I'd start clearing out what no longer served me. And that included the fantasy that my children would ever become the people I'd raised them to be. But before I could finish letting go of the past showed up at my front door. Sarah arrived 2 days later, unannounced. I heard her car in the driveway. That expensive SUV she'd bought last year. The one she'd somehow afforded despite always being a little short when bills came due. She didn't knock. She never did. Just walked in like the house still belonged to her in some inherited way. "Mom," she called out, her voice echoing through the hallway. I was in the kitchen, folding dish towels. I'd been moving slowly all morning, organizing drawers, finding strange comfort in the mundane tasks that didn't require emotion. "In here," I said. She appeared in the doorway, oversized designer handbag on her shoulder, sunglasses pushed up into her highlighted hair. She looked polished, put together, like someone who'd never missed a meal or a manicure appointment. "I've been texting you," she said, a hint of accusation in her voice. "I know. You didn't respond." "I've been busy," I said, continuing to fold. She set her bag on the counter with more force than necessary. "Busy with what?" I looked at her then, really looked at her. She was 43 years old, but standing there with her arms crossed. She looked like the teenager who used to stomp her foot when she didn't get her way. Just things that needed taking care of. I said evenly. She studied me with narrowed eyes. "Dylan called me. He said you met with a lawyer." "Ah. So that's why she was here. Not to check on me. Not to apologize for missing the funeral. But because she'd heard about the will." "I did," I said simply. "Why? Is something wrong? Are you sick?" The concern in her voice might have sounded genuine to someone else. But I'd known her for 43 years. I could hear the real question underneath. "Are you dying, and do I need to worry about my inheritance?" "I'm fine," I said. "Just updating some paperwork. Things change after you lose a spouse." She relaxed slightly, but her eyes were still calculating. "What kind of things?" I folded the last towel and placed it in the drawer. "Legal things. Estate planning. Nothing for you to worry about." "Mom." She stepped closer. "I'm your daughter. If you're making changes to the will or whatever, don't I have a right to know?" I turned to face her fully. "Do you remember your father's funeral, Sarah?" She blinked. "What? The funeral? 4 days ago. Do you remember it?" Her jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "Answer the question." "I told you I had an important meeting. I couldn't just." "You were at brunch," I interrupted quietly. "I saw the photos." The silence that followed felt like the end of something that had been dying for years. And what she said next would prove that I'd made exactly the right decision. Sarah's face flushed. Not with shame, with anger. "You were stalking my social media?" I was trying to understand, I said calmly, how my daughter could post pictures of mimosas while her father was being buried. I didn't," she struggled for words. "Mom, you're taking this completely out of context. That brunch was scheduled weeks ago. It was a networking thing. Important people were there." "More important than your father?" She threw her hands up. "You're being impossible. Dad would have understood. He always said work came first. He built his whole life around that principle." "He built his life around us," I corrected. "Around this family. And when he died, you couldn't give him 2 hours." "I sent flowers." "No," I said quietly. "You didn't." She opened her mouth then closed it. She'd forgotten she'd lied about that too. "Look," she said, switching tactics, softening her voice. "I know you're upset. I know this is hard. But punishing me by cutting me out of your will isn't going to bring Dad back." So Dylan had told her everything. "This isn't punishment," I said. "It's clarity." "What's that supposed to mean?" I walked to the kitchen table and sat down, suddenly tired. "It means I spent 50 years being your safety net. Every time you fell, I caught you. Every problem you had, I solved. Every bill you couldn't pay, I covered." "That's what parents do," she said defensively. "No," I said. "That's what I did. But parents also teach their children to stand on their own. To show up. To give back. And I failed at that part, didn't I? So this is my fault now? You're the one who—" "I'm not saying it's your fault," I interrupted. "I'm saying I enabled you to become someone who thinks love is measured in what you receive, not what you give." She stared at me, her mouth tight. I can't believe you're doing this. After everything. After everything? I leaned forward. Sarah, name one time in the last 10 years you've done something for me without me asking first. She was silent. One time you visited just to visit. One time you called just to talk. One time you helped without expecting something in return. That's not fair, she whispered. You're right, I said. It's not. But it's honest. She grabbed her purse, her hands shaking. So that's it? You're really cutting me out? Giving everything to Dylan. Dylan is the only one who showed up, I said simply. He's the only one who remembers what family means. She left without another word, and I sat there in the kitchen, feeling nothing but a strange, quiet peace. But if I thought Sarah was angry, I had no idea what was coming when Michael found out. Michael came the next afternoon. Unlike Sarah, he knocked, twice politely, then waited. That was always his way. More controlled, more calculated. Where Sarah was fire, Michael was ice. I opened the door to find him standing there with his wife, Jennifer, beside him. She wore her usual practice smile and a silk scarf that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Mom, Michael said, his voice carefully measured. Can we come in? I stepped aside without a word. They followed me to the living room but didn't take off their coats. A clear message. This wouldn't take long. Sarah called me. Michael began, sitting on the edge of the sofa. She was pretty upset. I imagined she was, I said. Jennifer crossed her legs delicately, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Helen, we understand you're going through a difficult time. Grief can make us do things we don't mean. I looked at her. I didn't come to your father's funeral either, Jennifer. She blinked. I had a conference call. International client. It couldn't be rescheduled. Everything can be rescheduled, I said quietly, when it matters enough. Michael cleared his throat. Mom, listen. I know I should have called. I should have been there. I was dealing with some things, and I didn't know how to face it. So you didn't. I'm sorry. He looked down at his hands. I really am. But this seems extreme. Cutting us out of the will completely. How did you know the details? I asked. He hesitated. Dylan mentioned something. And I may have called Richard's office. You called my lawyer? I wanted to understand what was happening. If you were being manipulated or... Manipulated? I almost laughed. By whom? Jennifer leaned forward. Helen, you have to admit, Dylan is very young. He doesn't have experience managing money or property. He could be taken advantage of. By people like you? I asked. The room went silent. Michael tried again. Mom, I know I've made mistakes. We both have. But we're your children. Doesn't that count for something? It used to, I said. When being my child meant showing up. When it meant caring about more than what you'd inherit. This is about money? Michael's voice rose slightly. You think we only care about money? No, I said. I think you forgot to care about anything else. Including your father. Including me. Jennifer stood abruptly. We should go, Michael. She's clearly not in a rational state. I'm perfectly rational, I said. For the first time in years, I'm seeing clearly. And as they left, I realized something important. I wasn't losing my children. I'd already lost them a long time ago. But the hardest part was still ahead, telling Dylan what I'd done, and hoping he'd understand why. Dylan called 3 days later. His voice was different, hesitant, unsure. Not the easy warmth I was used to hearing. Grandma? It's me. Can I come over? Of course, sweetheart. You're always welcome. I need to talk to you about something. My heart sank a little. Sarah or Michael had gotten to him. I should have expected it. He arrived within the hour, driving the old pickup truck he'd bought with his summer job money. He'd always been like that. Independent, proud, refusing handouts even when I offered. He hugged me at the door, but I could feel the tension in his shoulders. We sat in the living room, and I made tea chamomile for him, Earl Grey for me. He held the cup but didn't drink, just stared into it like he was searching for words at the bottom. Mom told me, he said finally. About the will. About everything. I figured she would. Grandma, I don't understand. Why would you do that? Why would you give everything to me? I set down my cup carefully. What did your mother tell you? She said you were upset about the funeral. That you were punishing them. That you're not thinking clearly. He looked up at me, his eyes troubled. She said I should talk you out of it. And is that why you're here? No. He shook his head quickly. I'm here because I don't want this to tear the family apart. I don't want to be the reason you and Mom stop talking. Sweet boy. Still trying to fix things that weren't his to fix. Dylan, I said gently. Let me ask you something. When did you find out your grandfather died? He was quiet for a moment. 2 days after. Mom mentioned it in passing when I called about Thanksgiving plans. She didn't tell you right away? No. His voice was soft. She said she forgot. And the funeral? I didn't know there was one until after it happened. His hands tightened around the cup. I would have been there, Grandma. You know I would have. I know. So why didn't anyone tell me? That was the question, wasn't it? Why hadn't Sarah or Michael thought their own son and nephew deserved to say goodbye? Because it wasn't convenient. Because it didn't fit into their schedules. Because somewhere along the way, they'd forgotten that love requires showing up. I don't know, Dylan, I said honestly. But that tells you something, doesn't it? He was quiet, processing. Your grandfather and I built something. I continued. This house, those savings, the cabin by the lake. We built it with our hands and our time and our sacrifice. And we always intended to pass it on. But we wanted it to go to someone who understood what it meant. Someone who knew the value of presence, not just presents. And what he said next made me realize I'd chosen the right person after all. Dylan set down his cup and looked at me with those honest eyes, William's eyes. Grandma, I don't want to take anything that causes this much pain. If it means losing you and Mom, losing Uncle Mike, I can't. You're not losing me, I said firmly. You're the only one who never left. But Mom and Uncle Mike made their choices, I finished. Just like I'm making mine. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the garden where William's rose bushes stood bare in the November cold. I remember helping Grandpa with those roses, he said quietly. I was maybe 12. He showed me how to prune them, how to protect them for winter. He said taking care of something meant being there for it even when it wasn't blooming. My throat tightened. He said that about people too, Dylan continued. He told me that real family shows up in winter, not just in spring when everything's easy and beautiful. I walked over and stood beside him. He was right. I tried to show up, Dylan said, his voice cracking slightly. After Grandpa got sick, I came every weekend. I mowed the lawn, fixed things around the house. Not because I wanted anything, but because... He trailed off. Because you loved him, I finished. Yeah. He wiped his eyes quickly. And I love you, Grandma. Not for what you have. Just for you. I took his hand. That's why you're getting everything, Dylan. Not as a reward. As a responsibility. Your grandfather and I worked our whole lives to build something that would last. But it only lasts if it goes to someone who understands what it's really worth. He turned to face me. What if I mess it up? What if I'm not ready? You're 20 years old. You're not supposed to be ready. But you have something your mother and uncle lost somewhere along the way. You have character. You show up. You remember. You care. They're going to hate me for this. They already hate that you're better than they raised you to be, I said. But that's not your burden to carry. We stood there together, looking out at the garden William had planted, the house he'd built, the life we'd created together. I have one condition, Dylan said finally. What's that? Teach me how to make those roses bloom again. I want to learn everything Grandpa knew. I want to keep this place alive the way it was when he was here. And in that moment, I knew William was smiling somewhere, knowing his legacy was in the right hands. But before I could truly find peace, I needed to understand just how deep the betrayal went.